Hi everybody. So, I used to think I had a problem with chord scale theory. What I've realised over time is actually I have a problem with chord symbols and the way that they are used in modern jazz education. Okay, so as with all of my criticisms of this kind of stuff, I'm aware that, who am I? I'm a bloke on the internet. I play guitar okay, but I'm not necessarily any big cheese in the jazz world or anything like that. I'm always kind of consciously aware that I am who I am. So I want to point out that most of what I say is kind of based in research and what I've heard more experienced musicians say, as well as also according with my own sort of feelings about these things and how I've seen them behave in both gigging and educational environments. So the thing about chord scale theory, for instance, is that actually chord scale theory is primarily concerned with the realization of chord symbols. It's pretty simple, really, if you think about it. So, for example, if you see a D13 sharp 11th chord, you know that's going to be a D Lydian dominant scale. In fact, the only information that you get from the names of the scales, which are confusing and hard to remember, is that it's basically the same thing as the 13th chord, but within one octave, right? So, as Barry Nettles and Richard Graff point out in their book Chord Scale Theory, chords and scales are two sides of the same coin. That's a central tenet of chord scale theory. So therefore, the fact that we call chord symbols and chord scales something different is a bit weird. We should really call them the same thing. We should say 13 sharp 11, not Lydian dominant, for instance. But obviously, this is the way the system has grown up, and one bloke on the internet isn't going to change any of that. But it helps to think about it in that way. So really, what we think of as chord scale theory is actually really concerned with the realization of chord symbols. Okay? And really, if you think about it that way, chord scale theory is really no different from, arpeggios. It's just that instead of playing, 3 or 4 note arpeggios, we're playing, full 7 note arpeggios and in various octaves and using intervallic combinations and stuff. But the basic idea is still the same. Chord symbols really govern vertical structures. So you know where the chord tones are within that. And there's various ways of exploring that. There's things like upper structure triads and sort of pentatonic modes and all the rest of it. But it all relates to the central basic idea. And I say this is the central tenet of modern jazz education. Now, to their credit, people like Nettles and Graff, in their book, for instance, point out that not every chord has a relationship vertically with the melody over the top. And you can see that very clearly in the solos of people like Lester Young and Charlie Christian and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and Sonny Rollins, etc., etc., etc. You just need to look at the music itself and you'll realize that is the case. However, obviously, the way we teach now is very much based around that idea of vertical agreement. So that's one thing. But I think this is actually a symptom rather than a cause, okay? And I think if you look at the history of the way that chord symbols have become increasingly important to jazz musicians, you'll see why this has happened. So for instance, if we go back to the 20s and 30s, the music was largely orally communicated. If people learnt a song from music, it would be from one of the basic kind of songbook versions. And actually, often they would have quite a fleshed out piano arrangement. Jazz musicians such as Peter Bernstein still go back to these sources to learn standards because there's a lot of details in those arrangements that have been lost to, later jazz recordings. And of course, the changes have been reharmonized and changed and all the rest of it. And certainly it's not stuff you would get on a real book lead sheet, or maybe even necessarily some of the sort of defining recordings. So it's always interesting to go back to the original source and find out what, Cole Porter or whoever it is originally wrote for those changes. That's really interesting in itself. And an important part of learning the history of the song, if you're into that kind of thing. Now, on these old songbook charts, you'll see there appear these little ukulele chord boxes, or maybe just chord symbols. and these are really usually quite crap. To be honest with you, they're not very representative of the piano harmony. They're just like something that would fit more or less if you were, just busking the song and wanted to sing the melody over the top, but obviously not a very realistic source for actually learning the song. And this is probably the first instance really of chord symbol notation. And later on you get the tune deck system, which is a set of cards, which is probably where you start to see something like our modern lead sheet, where you have the melody of the song and the chords written. Notice that for a lot of these, the chords are really rather simple. They are just, major, minor, dominant, nothing too complicated. Again, not that far away from the ukulele arrangements. Now, the first fate books, I believe, start appearing in the 1950s, although somebody with a bit more historical knowledge might be able to correct me on that. And they are noted for not being very good, okay? So people know that these charts aren't right. So they treat them with a bit of skepticism. And then we go into the 1970s and we have the real book. And that is the first really good quality fake book, which is extraordinary to me because if you've ever seen the errata of the original, I think I had, was it the 5th edition real book, which is the one you had to go way around the back of the shop to buy, and you had to put it under your coat like this because it was illegal and all the rest of it. It's not like that today. And the actual charts were often quite inaccurate, and then you'd have the errata at the beginning, which would have a massive list of corrections that nobody ever read. So there's famous mistakes like just like the B section of epistrophe randomly not being there, or 4 bars being missing in decimado and stuff like this. So it gives you an idea of how incredibly bad the original fake books must have been if that was an improvement. The real book, the original illegal or unofficial, whatever you want to call it, real book from the 1970s is a fantastic historical document, by the way. It's as with all texts, you've got to look at it in the context it was written and understand it from a critical point of view. But it was a really epochal thing, I think, in driving jazz education a certain way. And then you sort of start to see a bit of an agreement between books like the Mark Levine Jazz Theory book and Aebersold and all the rest of it, where a kind of common practice approach to jazz education was established. So the idea, here are the chord symbols, these are the scales that go with the chord symbols, this is how we play. And then further on down the line, we have now evolved to the point of, the iReal app, which only preserves the chords. Now, Ethan Iverson has a whole rant about this. Check out Do the Math, about how this is representing jazz standards in a really unhealthy light because you don't even have the melodies, at least the real book had the melodies, for all that it misses out, details of the song. For instance, Adam Neely talks about the counter melody it misses out in Girl from Ipanema, which is why nobody plays it anymore. Many jazz YouTubers have criticisms of the real book. Jazz Duets was talking about Lonnie's Lament, the fact that the chords aren't right. You got Adam Neely talking about Girl from Ipanema and other stuff. So, and you talk to any experienced jazz musician, they'll tell you that the only way to learn songs is by ear and checking out different versions and getting deep into it. The real book and iReal and products like that can only really act as a way of being able to fake it on a gig, which is why they were called fake books originally. The real book being a pun, it's like, it's a better fake book. It's a real book, That's all that ever meant. So, okay. And the other thing I want to talk about is big band charts. Big band charts, obviously, as arrangements got more complex, there became more of a need for more complex chord notation. So if you ever looked at big band charts, if you ever played in a big band, you'll see quite a range of guitar charts going from, it's basically a rhythm changes or honeysuckle rose, whatever you happen to be playing at that point, Nestico charts or whatever, to things where they've actually tried to put quite a lot of the horn arrangement into the chords, which are a lot more fun to read and a lot more challenging, but also you're kind of thinking like, nobody's going to hear that because I've got a bunch of saxophones and a bunch of trumpets and a bunch of trombones who are all playing this harmony. So all I basically need to do is just go, whatever. So it's kind of a bit extra, but it is quite fun. So you see these quite detailed guitar charts for big band, where you're thinking like, is that a blues? Is that rhythm changes? Oh yeah, crazy. And actually those can be really fun for learning from, because you learn all these little interesting substitutions and melodic things you can do. So definitely check those out if you can. So I suppose the point I'm trying to say is that I'm not anti-chord symbols, but I think we have to understand their context. And I think chord symbols should be treated with the same sort of skepticism that you might reserve for, mythology or something, So it's like, yeah, some of that might happen, but, it's good not to be bound to them. And I think that's a big problem. So, like, for early students of jazz, people who are just, beginners coming into it, they look at these things as being a holy writ, or kind of like, the Ten Commandments etched into stone or whatever, and that is 100% what they are not. They are essentially just things to help you fake your way through a tune. And as a basis for jazz harmony or jazz improvisation, they are really, really, I hate to use this word, but problematic on a number of terms. So I thought, because there's nothing like being negative about stuff, I thought I'd do a whole list of stuff that I find problematic about chord symbols. So I think a lot of these criticisms, if you happen to play piano, go away, right? I think one of the best things you can do as a jazz student is just play things on piano. Just simple, slightly, rubbish arrangements of things, C major, basic grips, no technique, doesn't matter. Just seeing it laid out on the keyboard in front of you will make you understand a lot more. And I think probably a lot of what I'm about to say is based around the fact that the guitar is such a shapes and grips oriented instrument that we don't really think enough about, for instance, keys or things like that. So a lot of these things, like pianists, are just going to go like, okay, well, that's fine. I've never had a problem with that. And I understand why, having played a little bit of piano myself. I mean, I'm rubbish, but I do, you don't need to be a good pianist to understand this. Right. So, okay, first of all, I don't like the way chord symbols encourage you to build everything from the bottom. So, for instance, if I play E minor over C major, here's C major 7th, and I'm playing an E minor. That's got a certain emphasis, right? It's got a certain vibe. And it's very much E minor I'm thinking of. It's not, C major 9th, right? But if you're thinking about chord scales or chord symbols, you would write C major 9 on your chart, okay? Because we're always limited to think about the root. Okay, so that's one drawback, and I think like Jordan Clemens, friend of the channel, has a lot of interesting points to make about this, and he's coming from the Stephen Harris approach, which details. Really, I think you could say like a lot of the jazz chords we come across, like major 7ths, 9ths, that kind of thing, as being composite sounds between a lower shell voicing that you might play on piano in sort of left hand, for instance, and what you usually get called upper extensions, but I don't even like that term upper extension because it's so sort of like, building up from the root every time, and I don't think that's always the best way to go. So when I study, like, for instance, a Charlie Parker solo or something, I kind of examine it as being a freestanding structure. So if I see, Parker playing, for instance, a very common thing would be like playing a B half diminished arpeggio over G7. I think of that as being a B half diminished or a B full diminished or whatever it is arpeggio. I try not to think about that as being like some kind of extension of G7, which might seem weird, but the thing is that if I do that, then I can usually sort of relate a wider bunch of things. Because, for instance, like if somebody like Parker or Lester Young is playing F major over a D minor 7th, and then they play F minor, going to C, well, E minor in that case, I can see that as being, okay, we're going from a subdominant function chord in the key of C to a tonic function chord, and there's some kind of, nice chromatic voice deepening in between, which to me is a lot more useful than going like, well, okay, so they're playing D minor 7, and then they're moving to some kind of G7 sus flat 9 sensibility, and then they're going to G minor 9, C minor 9. That is clunky, and I think chord symbols encourage you to think that way. Okay, another thing, right? Okay, so for instance, let's take Girl from Ipanema. You're in F major. I mean, you shouldn't be, but you are, because it's the real book. Okay, and then we go to G7, and then we go G minor 11th, F sharp 7 sharp 11th, F major. All right, so the problem I have with that is that this chord seems very exotic from the point of view of what you'd write down as a chord symbol. And then you go, well, you know, on the F sharp 7 sharp 11th, I would play the F sharp linear dominant. Whereas in fact, actually, the thing is that it's basically diatonic apart from one note. It's just the tritone substitution of that bog standard C7 shape. And the only thing that makes it different is the fact that we're going down chromatically to F instead of the 2-5-1 motion, right? And I think like chord scale and chord symbol stuff is full of that. So anything that's on a chromatic root within a diatonic key is going to look really flipping complicated. For instance, you know, B flat 7 sharp 11th in the key of C. This chord has got diatonic melody on top, which is why it's useful, an E, right? So you see this, for instance, in Cherokee, tunes like that. You'll often see it with a major third of the key. So that's an E in the key of C, and we've got the B flat 7, which is the backdoor chord. Two things go together. This chord is chromatic, but the sharp 11th is not. The sharp 11th belongs to the prevailing key. So it's things like that I think are a bit confusing. And again, if you're a pianist, you know this. Maybe as a guitarist, you could write it out in notation, if you're fluent in notation, which is another side issue, isn't it? Okay. So another thing that happens because of this is that the chords end up appearing much more diverse and complicated than they actually are. So for instance, there's a wide category of chords I've talked about in other videos which have, you know, basically diatonic subdominant chords, except for the fact that they have a flat 6 instead of a natural 6 in the key. So in the key of C, that's chords that are, you know, like the usual subdominant function chords, D minor 7, F major 7th, maybe B half diminished, even G7, you know, so dominant as well. And these chords are obviously not, you know, one chords, they're not tonic chords, but they have, if you flatten the 6th, you get D minor 7 flat 5, F minor major 7th, and so on, right? And my argument would be that these chords are all basically kind of akin, because, you know, and you know, the main difference, I suppose, between some of them would be whether or not they have a B in. That voicing is really closely related to this, which is closely related to that, which is closely related to this, you know, which is closely, you see what I mean? So there's lots of chords that have that same. And if you think about it from a chord scale perspective, you might think of that as being harmonic major, or if you're a Barry Harris student, you might think of it as being major 6th diminished. But the thing is that it doesn't matter. These things are all flat 6. They're all basically F minor-y kind of vibes. And if I put the B in, they're all kind of a bit diminished, you know. But you can have that diminished with the 13 as well. You know, so for me to think about that flat 6 then makes sense, because if I'm playing a melody over the top and I come to say D minor, and then maybe if we went to F minor 6th, I want to target the 6th there. But then so now I can also do that for a 2-5-1, D minor, G7 flat 6, C major, which is something you hear, for instance, you know, Leslie Young, Jim Hall, all sorts of people doing. That's a really useful result. So I think chord scales can obscure that. I've already talked about the tendency of the iReal app to make people think that jazz is purely about realizing chord symbols. I would say, furthermore, about charts, it's not always clear what extensions they include and what they don't. So there's a bit of diversity of approach. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but you can't necessarily expect the chord chart to tell you what the melody is. When you're accompanying somebody, this can be a problem, because if you play a flat 13, for instance, and you've got a singer singing a 13 over the top, they're going to be thrown off. Unless they're very experienced, it's going to be hard. So a lot of the time, I think it's better if you just keep the chords simple if you don't know. But certainly if you have a melody, you have a better chance of understanding whether or not you're getting in the way of the singer. And of course, it's quite good to learn like diatonic extensions, so that sharp 11th on a B flat I mentioned earlier, things like that, just so you have a repertoire of chords which don't kind of make too many waves. And that's experience and learning. And of course, if you can do a chord melody arrangement of the tune, that's helpful because you can see how the chords, even if it's a rubbish one, you can see how the chords and the melody relate. And that's important if you want to be more than just somebody who looks at the chords and goes like, oh, that's a natural 13, so I'll play a natural 13. It gives you more scope for both creativity, but also makes you a better and more supportive accompanist. Okay? So finally, I think, I touched on this thing, which I think I called the cult of verticality. And it's really, I don't blame anybody for this. I don't blame Mark Levine. I don't blame Jamie Aebersold. I don't blame the Berklee School of Music or anything else. I think all of those people are vastly experienced educators and really much better jazz musicians than I would have hoped to be, who understand all of this stuff. They're also trailblazers. They were trying to establish a way of teaching jazz that would be helpful. And I think now that we've got, 40 years in hindsight, it's reasonable to critique this and sort of examine where we've ended up in terms of our educational practice. As I say, if you play piano or if you end up, in playing jazz in New York City, for instance, this is not going to be an issue. You're going to learn this stuff pretty flipping quickly. But jazz is also an international and non-local form of music, so I think it's important that we remember the things about it that are part of that core tradition and the process of the music, rather than kind of turning it into this mathematical thing whereby you look at a bunch of chords and you play. Not that that's not a useful skill. I mean, if you've got an unfamiliar bunch of chords in a chart that don't seem to make any sense, you're probably going to end up playing the chord symbols in whatever way, whether it's chord scales or realizing chord tones. That's just a natural skill that you end up doing as a jazz musician, or end up using as a jazz musician, should I say. But I'd say like that cult of verticality is a bit annoying. So it's like people feel they can't play certain notes over a dominant chord because they don't match up. Classic one would be like, using the major seventh over a G7. Well, it's fine if you go into a G, it's really not a problem. And there's many ways to voice lead into a target chord. I think if Jacob Collier has shown anything to young people, it's that really, in terms of voice leading, you can do whatever you like, provided you end up at the target. And his arrangements are full of, obviously incredibly clever and convoluted ways of doing that. And you can do it with microtones, as he's shown as well, if you want to. So it's like the difference between a static chords and a moving chords is really important. And I think, finally, the thing is just moving away from that kind of ear learning and from that kind of mobile sense of harmony where it's about voice leading. And if you look at something like Bach, for instance, you can see that very much so. We can also see it in the Charlie Parker solo or whatever. It's the idea of chords moving towards a destination, not simply being static moments in time. And, the move away from ear learning, which I think the chord symbol approach to jazz education represents, is also troubling. So if you take anything away from this video, and I would also suggest watching, I'm going to pop up a link to a Richie Hart interview by a friend of the channel, Nikhil Hogan, I hope I'm saying his name right, who has an excellent channel, criminally underviewed, with all sorts of amazing interviews with amazing musicians. So definitely go and watch that. And he basically makes most of the same points that I'm making here, with a bit more historical context because he was actually there, and he still teaches, I think, at Berklee as well as one of the instructors there. So his insight is invaluable. But I think if you want to take one thing away from this, it's just be a bit skeptical about chord charts. They're not anything to get too exercised about. They're just a kind of loose guide if you don't know the song. And that's really all they are. And that's all they ever were. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you find it helpful. Bye.